Olá, muito boa noite. Cá estamos para mais uma grande entrevista da série Pertinente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Hoje vamos estar à conversa com um dos maiores especialistas em economia urbana. Professor na Universidade de Harvard, nos Estados Unidos, o professor Edward Glaeser é também escritor e publicou várias obras sobre o funcionamento das cidades, incluindo o best-seller internacional O Triunfo da Cidade. Vamos estar à conversa e a debruçar-nos sobre o tema de Covid, como afetou a dinâmica social, profissional, económica dos centros urbanos, olhar para os desafios também atuais na sustentabilidade dos mesmos centros urbanos e o que podemos esperar das cidades do futuro. Portanto, vamos a isso, vamos dar as boas-vindas ao professor Edward Glaeser. Ed, an absolute pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you. And let's get the ball rolling. Let's get going with a question that is obvious in our times. How has the pandemic and did the pandemic affect the life of cities and the present and future of urban centers, in your opinion?
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here. In a sense, cities are best defined as the absence of physical space between people. At their heart, cities are density, proximity, closeness. And so the rapid fire social distancing that was experienced around the world starting in late March of 2020 was, in a sense, the rapid fire de-urbanizing of our world. Now, we've now been through a year and a half of this. The Delta variant is still going. We have vaccinations spreading and we're starting to reopen, but it's hard not to think that this is some sort of major hinge in our urban world. Now, I believe that humanity's desire to be next to other humans will not be repealed by this disease. As someone who teaches for a living, I can tell you just how much more magical and powerful it is to be in the same room with other people. But there's no question that there are challenges ahead, and there's no question that the rise of remote working, the rise of Zoom, will also make a difference. I think going forward, we have to have two scenarios in mind. The first scenario is one in which we are, getting over this disease. We are going to make investments to make sure that we don't have another pandemic within the next 5 years. And in that case, we can start to get things back to normal. In the worst scenario is one in which this pandemic continues to rage and we get a second pandemic within the next decade. And I'm not even going to touch on that one. But even in the optimistic scenario, right, every city is more vulnerable than ever. Talent is more mobile than ever. While face-to-face work will come back, there will be some remote work, which will put some downward pressure on commercial real estate. I think the most likely scenario is one in which cities that can attract and retain global talent will actually thrive, because in fact, people will find it easier to move across space. So for example, I have friends who've retired from Brazil to move to Lisbon for many reasons, quality of life being a significant part of one. That's an asset that Lisbon has that will continue to matter. So I think cities can thrive out of this, but they have to recognize that they have to deliver as much value as possible to the most talented individuals who have only become more mobile because of the pandemic.
I'm going to give you a very specific example. During my career, when I had the choice, I always tried to live closer to the city center, to the heart of the action. Having lived in London, in Atlanta, in Geneva, having lived in Lisbon since I moved back to Portugal, I recently moved out of the center of the city. And I think this had a lot to do with the pandemic as well. And like you mentioned, the remote working. After centuries of people flocking to cities and wanting to be in the heart of the action, do you see a change in that short term, at least, as people go and look for more space and perhaps a more healthy lifestyle?
So in the short run, there's no question that we have seen both housing prices and rents level, as in there's been a tilt where places that are farther away from the city center have gotten more expensive, have found it easier to sell more quickly, whereas there's been less price growth at the urban core. That reverses the last 25 years, where the action was all in the other direction, where suburbs languished and central cities boomed in terms of housing prices. I expect that going forward, the rise of telecommuting does indeed increase the demand for having more space at home, as does the fear of disease. But for many younger workers, they're not ready to move to the suburbs. And so I would expect cities to tilt in the sense that they will become younger. Businesses will become younger in the city. So one of the things we've noticed is that teleworking works best for people who have established relationships and have longstanding jobs. They know what they're doing. They're going to keep on doing what they're doing from home or from wherever they want to do it. But businesses have found it hugely problematic to onboard new workers. So whereas Microsoft tells us programmers are just as productive when they're remote than when they're on site, the overall number of online advertisements for programmers was down by over 40% between November 2019 and 2020, right? Huge difference there. And that really suggests that, if you're just starting your business, if you're just starting new workers, you're going to want to really be still in the city center. And likewise, if you're a middle-aged individual with 3 kids and living in the suburb is just fine. But I think for most of my graduate students, for most people in their 20s, that doesn't sound like such a great deal to them, and they'd rather deal with a little bit less space to be closer to other young people in the heart of the city.
Obviously, you study the relationship between cities and democracy. In the Middle Ages, there was a German proverb that said, "The air of the city liberates." Is that still the case now, and with big urban centers and I guess in the booming economies? I'll ask you about the States, but I also want to know your opinion on, and we talk about China a lot on this series. I want to get your opinion on if that's still true, and especially in the developed and booming economies, if that's true as well.
So I believe that for the developing world, there's no path to prosperity that does not run through city streets. That in fact, urbanization, for all of its difficulties, was the way in which Latin American countries became much wealthier. So in the 1960s, there was a lot of discussion of how Mexico and then Brazil had become more than 50% urbanized in the early 60s, and yet they were poor countries, they were non-industrial countries. Over the last 50 years, they have become significantly wealthier, and urban economies played a huge role in making that happen. Urban areas have also been a critical path towards democracy. It's much easier to organize in urban areas. It's much easier to organize protests. It's much easier to create movements in urban areas. And that's even true in China, where there's a whole Shanghai crowd that sees itself in not opposition to Xi Jinping, but as being a rival source of legitimate presence within the party, within the movement. So I think it's absolutely true that cities are the place in which we should expect democratic movement to occur and democratic opposition to autocratic leaders. It's also true that in the West, the path towards better government really came about in the 19th century when cities tried to grapple with their public health challenges then. When they tried to build aqueducts, when they tried to build sewers. This was the moment in the 19th century when governments stopped being simply agents of death, which is basically all governments did prior to 1800 was to kill people. And over the course of the 19th century, they actually started making people live longer by building sewers. And that was really something that the cities gave us.
I know that I want to bring up this game, SimCity, because I know you played it in grad school. I played it growing up. I'm sure a lot of people watching this interview know what it is, a simulator where you basically can create your own city. Let's look into this and go back to when you were playing it in grad school and the modern city. How much have the priorities changed for anyone running a city and creating the perfect model?
Well, I think things are clearer than they used to be. So I remember SimCity in the early 1990s or late 1980s, there was a lot of attention to things like manufacturing, as well as sewage treatment plants and public safety. Manufacturing, of course, has continued to become largely irrelevant for most urban areas. It's not that manufacturing is irrelevant for economies at all, but manufacturing factories typically are very space intensive. They use a lot of machines relative to bodies, and hence they're a very poor fit to urban areas. That's in part why the pandemic has been so difficult economically for our cities, because when the factories left, what happened is that workers switched into being urban service workers. I mean, 1/5 of the American employed labor force in 2019 was in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, where the ability to serve a cappuccino with a smile was an employment safe haven when the factories left. And yet when that smile turns into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure, those jobs can disappear in a heartbeat. So at the less educated side of the spectrum, it's really about the urban service jobs and trying to figure out how to make sure people can get to those jobs, making transportation work. And so housing, particularly for lower income individuals, and transportation connections to the places where the richer people who tend to buy those expensive cappuccinos live. Now, at the high end, it's all about attracting and retaining and training smart people, and then more or less getting out of their way. It's about high end, it's still services, but it's financial services, it's technology, it's management consulting, it's the knowledge workers who are the export of large cities. And so figuring out what works for that group and trying to make that group more attracted, which often involves just not over-regulating your entrepreneurs of entertainment, but also investing in the kind of assets that actually cause smart, well-educated people to actually come to the city. Those, I think, are the critical elements in city building in the 21st century.
But when it comes to city planning as well, and you mentioned about attracting, I guess, elite professionals, how do you maintain the kind of how do you create and then maintain the energy of a city in centers around professional areas, but also appeal to families of those elite professionals to stay in the city or around the city to keep it sustainable from an economic standpoint?
So that's been a traditional problem in cities. They can work perfectly well for childless 20-somethings. In fact, they can be Eden for childless 20-somethings. And as long as they're safe from crime, they work well for what we call empty nesters, people for whom the kids have left the home and moved out. But there's traditionally been this missing middle of families who find it very difficult. And that's really two things. One of which is just these families live space-intensive lives, and so they're looking for places where housing is a little bit cheaper, where maybe they can have land, where their kids can play around outside. And so that's always going to pull them a little bit out to the suburbs. But the second thing is schools. The second thing is making sure that there are educational opportunities for kids in central cities that work better. Both of these areas are ones in which city governments can do a better job. So in terms of housing costs, the main issue is just not making it too difficult to build. So the central thing to make cities more accessible to ordinary people, to ordinary families, is to make sure that it is relatively easy to get permits to deliver new housing for ordinary people. The even larger problem is the schooling problem, especially in the US, where while cities are fantastic forges of human capital, places where you get smart by being around other smart people if you're 30, if you're 10, they appear to be terrible. And all the data we have from the work of my colleague Raj Chetty and his Opportunity Atlas suggests that, in fact, kids who grow up in cities, particularly kids who grow up in the center of cities, do end up doing much worse as adults relative to their suburban counterparts. And that's really failing of the central cities school districts in the US. I would argue strongly that after 20 years of school reform in the US, and I'm not going to opine on Portugal's education system, but in the US, there's a strong case for doing things that are more experimental, that wrap around traditional schooling, that do things like train people to be programmers or electricians, but do so after school, on the weekends, over the summer, and then competitively source it, right? Let trade unions compete, let for-profit companies compete, and pay only if the company has delivered the skills, because you can measure whether or not someone is a programmer or plumber at the point of graduation. So you really can have competition and pay for performance. So by that way, you just sidestep the traditional urban school problems.
I wanted to pick up on that and ask you about conversations you have with experts in your field. And when it comes to city planning and making sure that cities remain attractive and appealing, at least the central areas of cities. Talk to me about how much sustainability is coming up, not only in the building aspect of cities, but in creating enough open spaces, creating enough park areas where people feel they can get a healthy lifestyle without moving out.
So absolutely, and I think the pandemic has only reinforced how incredibly valuable urban parks are, right? I mean, New York's great park, Central Park, was actually built partially in response to the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s. And so disease heightens our awareness that the ability to use exterior space is really, really valuable. And so I think that really has been reinforced in everyone's mind. But paradoxically, that only strengthens the case for allowing developers to build up. Because the best way that we make sure that we have space for parks is that we allow there to be enough space, moving up towards the sky around that. So we don't just chew up all that land for lower density dwellings. So building up, I think, is really the best way to complement the creation of those parks. Now, in terms of sustainability, I think it's a mistake to worry too much about the sustainability of the building per se. I think you always want to look at the sustainability of the life cycle. And for that reason, it's always easier, if you give me in a warm spot, a single or two-story building with lots of solar panels on the roof, right? It's really easy to make that, an incredibly sustainable single structure. But when the person who lives in that structure then gets in their car and then drives 45 minutes to get to work, all of that good work is undone, right? Whereas someone who lives in a skyscraper may in fact use more energy in their home, but they can walk to work, right? And so you really want to take into account the whole combination. My own work with Matthew Kahn on carbon emissions really does find that central cities are really greener. And that comes typically from the fact that people typically live in smaller housing units and they just travel much less. In the US, of course, that doesn't mean public transportation. In the US, it just means they're driving shorter distances, but they're driving 5 miles instead of 40 miles. And that still is a big win for carbon emissions. And so it's really important to recognize that density construction is really not the enemy of the environment. It's really the friend of the environment.
I wanted to ask you about, obviously you mentioned building up, and you're in a city that has been doing that for centuries, New York City. But in Europe, and I'll pick the case of Portugal, there are no skyscrapers, there are no significant high-rises. And I understand when you talk about building up and the impact that it has, a positive impact, rather than building out from a sustainability perspective and an environmental perspective. But if culturally a lot of countries don't do that, and I'm thinking again more of Lisbon, what advice do you have for traditional urban European centers who prize their architecture, who prize their identity, to grow, to do so sustainably, but maybe not in those high rises and skyscrapers that you see in stateside and even in other cities in more central and northern Europe? So,
given the need to deliver space, given the desire to sustainably, which means ideally at walking distances, you've got to deliver more density. That can be done with, very tall buildings on very small footprints, or 6-story buildings on larger footprints, or 10-story buildings on mid-level footprints. All of these options are available. And in some sense, it's a question of whether or not you want a modest disturbance over a lot of land or a major disturbance over a small amount of land. And I think you have to ask yourself, it's a hard thing in European cities, because the architectural legacy that many of them have are the patrimony of the world. So, and there are some cities in which you just give up. Like, for example, Bruges is fine the way it is. We don't need to develop Bruges. Bruges is a jewel built in the 15th century, preserved by the silting of the Zvin, which largely eliminated its economic relevance. And so it continues as this, beautiful relic. But I would say, let's move it away from the Portuguese context for a second. I think it would be a good thing if Paris could figure out where, just small sectors of the city, where it can allow more height. So particularly for residential buildings. So yes, sure, preserve large elements of Baron Haussmann's Paris, by all means, protect the Place des Vosges forever. Absolutely. But figure out modest areas of the city where you can allow significant building, and be aware that those areas can be smaller and smaller the higher you allow them to go. And so, we're just trying to make sure, great cities are archipelagos of neighborhoods that offer their residents different choices about where to live. And it wouldn't harm, even the most august European city to have a small neighborhood, which was perhaps looked a little bit more like Seoul or Tokyo.
When you think about the cities of the future, Ed, and again, climate change is a reality, being more effective and productive is a reality. What models do you see? What examples do you see where we should be looking to in order to create the not the perfect model, but not the utopia, because that's quite impossible. But what are those standards that city planners and city experts should be looking towards as they build towards the future?
So there are many aspects of Singapore's government that are really worth emulating. And they have a very professional government. They pay their public officials a great deal of money relative to what we're used to. And they have a relatively strong system of accountability within the government, which is all desirable. And part of the Singapore model is, very strong investment in children. And so that's one model that's worth emulating. So that's one in terms of the quality of the public service. Unfortunately, Singapore offers almost no guidance to a European city when it comes to actually city planning, because it's essentially a late 20th century city. It had very, very small historical bones to worry about. And so you have to ask yourself, what European cities are you most comfortable with thinking about in terms of planning? London has gone from allowing very little height in the 1980s to allowing it to a certain extent. Some fraction of that has been segregated in Canary Wharf, which is an example of sort of one of these small areas where you allow a lot of building in Canary Wharf, so you don't have to allow it otherwise. But there are also buildings which have the Gherkin, the Shard, which have sprung up in different parts of the city. I don't mind that, but I can understand how other people might. You have to figure out what culturally works for you. I think there are also good examples in Northern Europe as well, where height has been allowed in different places. Berlin has had a lot of building activity. So it's doable. But in the case of Lisbon, it really has to be a European model, because very little in terms of the US just feels at all relevant. Very little in terms of East Asia feels at all relevant, because there just isn't the same historical legacy. There isn't a single monastery in all of the US that can compare with Batalha, right, for example.
That is true. But again, as we try to look for models and scenarios that you look at around the world, if you could invest in a region around the world, where would it be, and which city would you choose to invest in and live in as well?
These are different questions.
Yes.
I grew up in New York. In terms of, I'll take the live-in easier. In terms of where I would like to live, I grew up in New York. There are lots of things that I love about New York, but I also think London is quite magical. I also, am still in love with Siena and Florence. And of course, there are many, I think Oporto is charming in its own sort of magical way. And I am very, very fond of the time I spend in Barcelona as well. So I couldn't possibly choose one place to live in, but those are places which all appeal to me a great deal. In terms of where to invest, in the US, it feels quite straightforward to me. The most economically dynamic parts of the US are the Sunbelt cities that are both pro-business and well-educated, right? So you have I have a relatively two-factor model of economic growth, one of which is how well are you educating your children? How attractive are you for high human capital individuals, right? And the second is, do you have laws that encourage businesses, or do you have laws that hold them back? Do you have laws that make it easy to build, or do you have laws that largely deter building? So the places that win on both of those measures in the US are, the Austin, Texases, the Atlanta, Georgias, the Dallas, the Plano, the Charlotte, these are places which have lots of education. Atlanta is basically as well educated as Boston, but it has a business environment that is totally different. The one thing I would watch out for is that the southern cities that are well educated are acquiring the sins of the educated coastal cities in terms of blocking new development. It seems like the first thing that happens when you have a whole bunch of very well educated people who move into an area because of its cheap housing is they figure out how to make sure the housing won't be cheap for anyone else. In terms of European cities, I would again look for the same thing. And again, it's hard to think about where we think current prices are relative to what they should be. But I see a lot to like, certainly in Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. I see a lot to like in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Scandinavia, again, because of this combination of education, which has been very robust in those areas, plus an ability to reform themselves. I mean, if we think about both Germany and Sweden, these are places that had gone very far towards social democracy in the 80s and 90s, and it wasn't working, and they saw that it wasn't working, and they actually were able to make changes. Whereas France has had much more difficulty reforming itself. Italy has had much more difficulty reforming itself. And so these are also, that being said, would I rather live in Florence, or would I rather live in as much as I like Gothenburg, I would take Florence any time. So, but I probably would rather invest in Sweden. So,
final question, and every year you see these rankings of best cities in the world coming out. A variety of publishers have these, whether it's quality of life, standard of living, best cities to work in, best cities for families, whatever it may be. How much, I'm not going to ask you to give us your ranking, but how much do you think these matrices have changed on what are the best cities from judging from the past to the future? So 30 years ago, the variables that were decided for the best cities, how different do you think those variables are in 20 years' time, where people are looking for the places to live?
There's both a great deal of continuity and a great deal of change. The oldest one of these lists that I know of dates from about 390 CE. It was put together by a Gallo called Ausonius, who has a ranking of the 20 top cities in the world. Unsurprisingly, Rome is number one without any possible comparison, followed by, and I don't remember which order it is, Constantinople and Carthage, and then Antioch and Alexandria. Bordeaux comes in 20th, Athens comes in 15th. So we've had 1,600 years of these rankings. I think having a patriarch, having a traditional church patriarch has gone down on the rankings over time. That was a big thing in the 5th century. I think that's generally become significantly less important. But more seriously, the more that you think about, the post-Zoom world, the more that you need to focus on, who's going to be most mobile and what are they going to care about above all. And, I have a long-standing debate with my friend and fellow urbanist, Richard Florida. We both agree strongly that attracting creative, knowledgeable people is absolutely central. Richard tends to think of them more as, 20-somethings who like to go eat at hip cafes and really have a sort of, hip, creative lifestyle. I tend to think more of the 37-year-old lab worker, scientist who's, mom with 2 kids. What she really cares a lot about is safe streets and a good commute and good schools for her kids. I think there's truth in both vantage points, but going forward, I think you have to ask yourself which of these groups are going to be more mobile, and you have to play a little bit more to them. And I think if anything, that pushes a little bit towards Richard's viewpoint and away from mine, that at least in the immediate future, it's going to be the young and the restless who are going to be the most focused on this. And I somewhat fear for that, because it's, that means that cities can take their eye off the ball of working on schools and safety. And schools and safety are the more important thing for the long run health of the country. But in the short run, it's the young who are going to be most mobile. And that pushes a little bit towards the things that they care about, which has a lot to do with fun, but also, relative affordability, relatively easy transportation, and a city that welcomes. And I think that's also part of the magic. Is if you think about the difference between 2 cities, both of which I greatly admire, Seoul and Tokyo. Seoul is vastly more open to Westerners than Tokyo is, vastly. right? And that is an incredible asset. And I think looking forward to the 21st century, I would say, in fact, this willingness to embrace outsiders is as important as anything else that a city can bring going forward.
It's a really interesting point. To close this conversation, we have our traditional quickfire round. So in a few words or in one sentence maximum, I'd like you to try to answer these questions, and I'm aware that normally you would take longer. First one, which is the most important message you would have for those who are designing and planning the cities of the future?
Build for people, not to build impressive structures.
Okay, good point. What will be at the core of the successful cities of the future? Sustainability, infrastructure, transport access?
Building on a human scale, building for the things that humans need to actually make their lives as desirable, as functional as possible.
Judging by your interaction and experience of working with leaders, what is one personality trait that a good leader should have?
The ability to get your subordinates to do things even when they don't have to. For most cities, the big problem isn't policy, it's capacity. And so getting your subordinates to actually work for you is the most important thing.
And finally, what is the biggest challenge humanity faces in the next decade in your realm, in your landscape?
Making sure this pandemic is a once-in-a-generation thing, not that we have another one.
Professor Edward Glaeser, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I've learned tremendously, and I'm sure our audience has as well. All the best, stay safe, and let's hope that this pandemic is truly behind us. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Uma conversa extremamente interessante sobre as cidades do presente, as cidades do futuro, os centros urbanos, como é que podem e devem sobreviver no futuro, como é que devem atrair pessoas criativas, educadas, que possam garantir que os grandes centros urbanos continuem a ser áreas atrativas e que não percam todos esses recursos para os subúrbios e para áreas onde há menos densidade populacional. Foi muito interessante aprender com o professor Glaeser sobre a experiência que ele tem sendo de Nova Iorque a lidar com grandes cidades e como é que cidades europeias como Lisboa, como o Porto, podem também crescer e aqui não há dúvida, tendo em conta a preocupação para manter a identidade da cidade, mas o professor Glaeser, é claro, defende que é preciso construir em altura, é preciso talvez investir mais em edifícios mais altos para garantir a sustentabilidade das cidades e também do próprio espaço. Foi mais uma conversa nesta grande série da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos Impertinente, porque, como sabe, quando há factos, há argumentos.